in the last lecture was like, order of the speeches, resolution that you're debating about, and then, here's what a 1AC looks like. You have to have all the shit. And then the 1NC, the different off-case arguments and on-case arguments. And so on-case arguments is where you directly respond to the affirmative. So one of the documents that are online now is just like a no first use affirmative where the Congress constrains the executive's ability to use nuclear weapons first. And this could be a really important issue given like the withdrawal from arms agreement treaties with Russia and the development of like low yield nuclear weapons now. And so it's like a really pertinent issue. And so this is where you'd be like, no first use doesn't work, having first strike capabilities is better, the executive would just override Congress anyhow, and so those would be like the on-case responses. And then the off-case responses, the disads, counterplans, critiques, procedural arguments, those are generic ways you can answer any of them. So if somebody runs surveillance, or if somebody runs stuff like along the lines of like trade, or in regards to treaties, you have generic responses. And so one counterplan is the executive should self-constrain his authority opposed to having Congress do it. So no matter what the affirmative team says, you could use that counterplan. So if you're just better at saying, well, the powers that be say it's an executive power and not a congressional or judicial power, then we should go this way, and that would be an example of a counterplan. And then the debate is not, should we have no first use, but the debate is about who gets the call on that, Congress or the executive branch. And so you could use an off-case argument like that, or you could just say, no first use bad, first strike is important to be able to deter the United States enemies. And so those are the differences between on and off-case arguments. When we get to constructing 1NCs, there's a spot on the syllabus that says 1NC assignment due. You're sort of picking what are the generic arguments you're going to do, and then whatever you're going against will be your sort of case arguments that would be specific that you need to have from round to round. Okay? Today it's going to be like, how can the affirmative respond to those off-case arguments, and then also how you could go about judging the debate round and how debate takes place after that. Okay? So the first thing that is on the quiz is, what are the 3 ways to compare evidence? Because in this day and age, you could literally find a piece of evidence that says one thing and a piece of evidence that says the other thing. And in debate, because you can't use your own bias to say, well, I trust MSNBC or I trust Fox News, to be like, well, this is the more legitimate source, you have to actually debate about those in round based upon where both sources are getting and relying their evidence about. And so one of the things you debate about is why one's evidence is better. So if you say no first use is good, and the negative team says no first use is bad, you could say our evidence is better because, and one of the ways that you could do it is based upon qualifications. Who is the author writing? If it's just some like news correspondent, they're informed because they have reporters and stuff, but they might not be as informed as a military expert who's actually in the field and like is in control of a nuclear arsenal, who understands how other countries and how that individual general responds. So maybe the military official is more qualified than a news pundit. You could also say that maybe a professor who studies international relations and has reviewed history might be more qualified because they have an outside view. All of those steps are debatable because you could say that, well, news reporters are able to get more information from different sources that are not officially disclosed, so we should trust that more. Or you could say the news sources are just biased because they want to be able to get high ratings, and so they're going to put out whatever ends up selling, so listen to our military official. Or, of course, the military is going to say we want to have nuclear weapons because the military has a lot of jobs created based upon it. You should go to the professor who is able to evaluate this data objectively. There is no like right or wrong answer to any of these questions. These are things that individuals have to decide for themselves. But debating about what makes for a more qualified source also makes you a more informed individual, because that way, as you read things on the internet, you could be like, oh, well, this is a blog entry. Who's writing this? Oh, this is just somebody giving their hot take based upon what they believe and spewing their knowledge. Who wrote this article? Oh, this person's actually qualified because of whatever you think makes up a qualified person. In debate, you got to do that. Otherwise, people could literally just read a high school student's paper that got posted to the internet, and if you never qualify or attack that source, that's a source of evidence that's being used in a debate round. Qualifications is also how you decrease the credibility of the other side's arguments, and then also use your own intelligence to insert into the debate, because you all also are qualified to a certain extent, right? Like, you've studied, you're going to be doing research, you're going to be able to, have different opinions that come from different subject positions that might make you informed one way or another, and all of those are within the qualification debates. The other thing that you do is you make the argument that your evidence post-dates. And what that means is just my evidence was published more recently than your evidence, right? If you're talking about nuclear posture in the era of Obama, that's very different than like the era of Bush or Trump or Clinton. Each one of those eras are different. So it's like you might have a really good thinker that was at the top of their game back in the early 1990s, but the nuclear arrangement globally has changed over the last couple of years and even the last couple of months and weeks, right? And so saying your evidence is more recent is a reason for why your evidence should be preferred. The evidence that I'm putting online, all of that evidence, was produced sort of over the summer and the early part of this year by like different debate camps and different universities that came together. And so all of that evidence is going to be a little bit old. You're debating against each other, so in a lot of these debates it might not matter. But if you do your own research and you update that evidence and find a new article, like you could say, this was published a week ago, you should prefer it. In the debate rounds when you're judging, judges will have to default to this evidence and more credible. One of the reasons is because it post-dates. And so people who are inspired to do their own research, extra work in class, but helps you be able to win those debate rounds. The last thing is warrants. What the evidence is using to back up its opinion, right? And so a lot of things that get posted, especially a lot of news articles, is just like claim, 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 and they don't always disclose the sources of where they get their information from. So it's really just a bunch of claims. So what is the warrants within there, right? So the warrants could be based upon historical analysis. It could be based upon numeric calculations. It could be based upon just the citation of other scholars. Like what are the reasons for why that claim is true? All right. So the quiz question is: what are the 3 ways you can compare evidence? These are the 3 ways you can compare evidence. All right. Any questions on those? And like you understand like how it could be used within the debate round? Yeah. Who the author is? Like, is it a peer-reviewed source or is it someone's blog? Just because it's a blog doesn't mean it's not qualified. There are a lot of really qualified people who maintain blogs, but then you don't just be like from WordPress.com. You say from so-and-so scholar who is whatever their qualifications are, and if they're like, this is just from a WordPress site, you're like, yeah, but this is what this person does, so it's like they're free to post their opinions, versus someone who has a PhD or someone who works for the government or someone who's living there, right? So it's like, if you're talking about starvation overseas, maybe reading something for somebody who's starving overseas makes more sense as being more credible, but maybe that's also just really biased and subjective. Yeah.
Can you give another example of a warrant?
A warrant is, so like, if I say I like movies, that's a claim. The warrant to that argument is I like movies because every time I go there, I get entertained and I eat candy. And so the warrant is why that claim is true. And so, yeah. And so it's like, if you, like some of the best rhetorically powerful quotes come from like the beginning and the conclusion of articles because they're really trying to sell you on what they're saying, but doesn't have any warrants for why it's true. And so in the middle portion is a lot of times where it's like, it'll be citing math or it'll be citing like history and like what makes it, true. What's the science behind it or what sort of like reasoning it takes place. And so you could compare warrants. So even if like you're just a college student and you're talking about what in the world today, the warrants for why you believe something is also why your voice could be more credible than some scholar that's spouting some nonsense from the 1800s, right? So it's like you could win that debate, but you have to focus on the warrants and then compare the warrants of that debate. And so it's like, these sort of things work in tandem with one another. And I promise you that if you make the arguments and the other team doesn't make the arguments, I'll almost always vote for you because it'll be like, even if I believe your side, this team says, well, your evidence is biased and I shouldn't pay attention to it, and so I default to all of this evidence as being more credible in this debate round, and it makes for an easy victory. If you debate about it, that's when you actually get into some of like the real work in terms of figuring out why your studies are, more accurate. So it's like if you believe like trickle-down economics is good or bad, there's a lot of studies both ways, and you actually have to get into figuring out why that's the case. And you're looking at the scholars who produced it, when it was published, and what's the evidence they're using to back it up. What are their metrics that they're using to define, rising wealth? Which different scholars use different things, which changes everything else. So in debate, you should debate about those things. Any questions on that? All right. The next quiz question are: what are the 3 generic ways you compare impacts. And so, for instance, when I was in the Dominican Republic, the topic that they were debating was that the U.S. should end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And so a lot of the debates were arms sales to Saudi Arabia kills innocent people in Yemen. And then the other side said arms sales to Saudi Arabia helps to secure the region and be able to boost the economy. And so it's like economy and security versus, innocent kids dying. And then how do you weigh those two things are going to be, a largely subjective call. Yep.
What are the three generic ways
to compare impacts, right? And so in this example, the impacts are like loss of innocent life and like economy or global security. So one thing that you could do is you could talk about the magnitude, which is how big the impact is. So it's like, 6,600 innocent Yemeni individuals were died, and like 12 kids died on a bus trip where they got bombed using U.S. artillery. So it's like, that's bad. But if Saudi Arabia doesn't have the U.S. arms, it's not going to be able to help fight ISIS, and it's not going to be able to help, be able to make sure Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. And so the magnitude of potential nuclear war or another terrorist attack is larger than some innocent civilians in terms of magnitude, right? Because there's a greater number of people dying. So in terms of utilitarian calculus, debate generally operates on the question of magnitude. How many lives can you save? If we constrain the executive's power, how much better would it be for the economy? The next thing is probability. How likely is this impact to happen? The chance of another terrorist attack is likely, potentially. Iranian nuclearization is also likely, potentially. But the death of the innocent people in Yemen are 100% because we know that's ongoing now based upon even like U.S. intelligence reports. And so there's a debate about the numbers, but we know 100% those innocent people are dying with U.S. weapons, but the magnitude is greater. And so in debate, you're going to have to weigh the probability of the magnitude against the other team's probability of the magnitude, right? So it's like aliens are going to kill you if you go outside, means that why leave this classroom because you don't want to risk dying. But the probability of that is so small that none of you are going to want to stay in this classroom and you're still going to leave. And so the small probability can outweigh a big magnitude. And the last thing is time frame. When's it going to happen, right? How long until the impacts take place? People are dying now, people might die in the future. If both sides are talking about economic collapse, like in the no first use debates, one side will say no first use stops nuclear war, the other side says first use is actually what stops nuclear war. And so they're dealing with the same probability and magnitude, but they could have a different time frame on when the nuclear war might happen. And so I would rather live for 10 more days than die today because it's pushed off into the future if the magnitude's the same and the probability is the same. Also, if you talk about something like the sun is eventually going to explode and no life will be able to be sustained on this planet, inevitably the ultimate magnitude will happen. Inevitably the universe will collapse back on itself, and that probability is also like up to 100%. But like we don't live every day you're just being like, oh, okay, well everything's dead, because the time frame is so far in the future. We're dealing with more immediate, smaller magnitudes and impacts, and as that time approaches, maybe we ramp it up, right? That's also like climate change. If like the most far out there climate scientists who say that like we're going to go extinct and it'll be irreversible within the next 100 years, they have a question on some of their probability and their time frame, because I'd rather live 100 years than potentially tank the U.S. economy today, send us into economic recession that then causes a bunch of global war, because that's going to cause climate change and kill us just as quick or quicker because of the time frame, even if climate change might be bigger. So all of those things again can be debated about, and it's magnitude, probability, time frame are the quiz answers. Is there questions on that? No? Okay. So the next quiz question is going to be, what are the 4 rules of judging? All right. And so these rules apply to all of the debates, but in the policy debates, when you're actually turning in ballots, these rules, you're going to be judged, you're going to be graded on the ballots that you turn in, which is based upon adherence to these rules. And so a lot of debates, you know, I believe you could go either way, but there are some debates that are like a very clear winner, and you have to sort of people need to be like discounting the rules in order to, you know, basically be able to vote in the opposite direction. And so I don't really lower grades for just voting in opposite, you know, incorrectly from me. But if you are consistently always in the minority and in clear decisions, you're just going the other way, you know, it is going to have some sort of impact on there. The first thing is just take notes. And so when you judge the policy rounds, you'll have your laptops. I'm okay with you taking notes on your laptop or even sort of filling out the ballot as things happen. So it's like if somebody does something in a speech, you're like, you like that, you write that down under the question of like things debaters did that you like. If someone talked too fast or you couldn't understand them or you wish they said evidence, there's a question like how could they have done better? You could write that down there, you know, there as well. The only thing you can't do until the end of the debate is actually vote. So the last question is like, I was compelled to vote because you can't fill that out until the full debate has been completed. The other thing that goes along with taking notes is pay attention. All right, and by pay attention, I mean like you're actually listening to debaters, and you're not, if you were taking notes on your laptop, you're not using it to, you know, go on social media, you're not using it to, you know, just watch sports, you're not using that to read other articles, you're using, you know, the laptop in order to actually be able to engage in the, you know, the round and not just sort of space out. And it is a honor system, but what I will say, it is also a biopolitical system. Because if you're far off in what you're saying, I'll be able to know. And so like the last question, like I was compelled to vote because if you're writing things that were not in that debate round, that part of your ballot grade is going way down because you did not pay attention to what ended up happening in that debate. And I always get some that it's like, this was an entirely different debate than what you actually, you know, described that took place on your ballot. And it's because they were just like, oh, I've seen the NFU debate a lot, or I've seen this other thing, because you'll judge them a lot between each other. And so people just like write the generic thing that they've written in the past couple ones. And when you get caught for that, you end up really going down. Also, when you're debating and you're being judged by your peers, you're going to want them to pay attention to you. And so you should show them that same respect, you know, in reverse as well. And so if you're typing on your laptop, it should be typing, taking notes. Like when I'm judging, I'll be writing a lot on my laptops, but my ballots will have substantially more than like what your peers will have. So, but like you could all, you know, do well with that. The other thing is a dropped argument is truth. So no matter what you believe, if the other team doesn't answer that argument, it is true. It's just, that's how it is. There's a question on the ballot that says things you wish the debater had said. You should put there all of the things you wish that they said because you don't believe what they've said, but you cannot use that belief to vote in a separate direction, right? So whether you say, you know, Trump is the savior or the devil, it does not matter if the other team doesn't answer that argument. You have to accept that regardless of where you're oriented. All right, and so this is one of the ways where debates can be more objective because people have the ability to educate each other and then put in the actual individual ballots why you believe a certain way, and you'll all get everyone's ballot, so you'll all see the ways that people are thinking, and you could adapt to that, or you could be like, okay, this belief, you know, I will adapt to a certain extent, but I still want to debate what I want to debate about, and so I'm not going to entirely reverse course. But the other thing is that, you know, I will know, and your peers will know if you're not voting on, like, you know, the question of dropped arguments. Now, it is up to the teams to point out a dropped argument. So if somebody doesn't answer your argument in your 2AC or 2NC at some point during that debate round, you should be like, the other team has conceded this point, which means, and explain why that conceded point wins you the debate round. Just because you might concede one point doesn't mean you win the debate round. It's like, who cares if Trump is good or bad? This is a debate about executive powers and whether the nuclear arms and treaty negotiation and trade powers rely with our president or with our Congress or our judicial branch. What does it mean for these branches to be in control? So even if I concede whatever about Trump, here's the more important argument in the debate round. You know, so just because someone drops an argument doesn't mean they lose the debate round. It just means they lose that point. And as a debater, if somebody drops the argument, you should point it out to the judges so all the judges know, okay, this is conceded, and then explain why that individual point wins you the round, right? when you're talking with your friends, at some point if they're not answering you, you should just be like, listen, I'm going to stop talking to you unless you answer this argument I'm making, because this is, you know, the true argument and you're just talking about a bunch of nonsense. And it's like, you know, that conceded argument, make them answer that. In presidential debates, all the time the candidates like don't answer the other team's argument. So it's like the debate instructor infuriates me because each ones are going through talking points opposed to answering the other one's side. And so it's like, well, I'm just going to, you know, believe what I believe, or I have to do all of my own research, opposed to them actually responding to one another. If you watch Ted Cruz, who was a former national champion not in policy debate but in another style, in his debates he actually starts doing things like if they're not responding to this point, numbers his arguments more often and things like that. And so he's sort of fun and enjoyable for me to watch. All right, the other thing that goes along with this is that you vote on what debaters say and not your opinion. So, just like a dropped argument is truth, if somebody doesn't say something, it's not questioned. And so it's like, if I'm like, you know, human extinction is good, and the other team never explains why human extinction isn't good, you, regardless of what you think about humans, you have to vote on what the debaters have actually said, and you could, again, on the ballot, explain all the things that they did. All right, very similar type stuff, but sometimes the question is not a dropped argument, but a question of who debated better. Like sometimes teams are going back and forth, and so it's like the dropped argument didn't become truth because it's not entirely true, but there's a debate on qualifications, post-dating, and warrants, or magnitude, probability, and time frame that you still have to evaluate, and regardless if you might think saving 100 lives is more important than saving one life in the moment, and you know, because you are a utilitarianist versus someone who, you know, responds to individual ethics in the moment, like you can't just insert that calculation outside of what debaters have actually said in that round. Now, if the debaters don't debate about it, then people will end up voting on their opinions more because it's not debated, right? If some team says, like, you know, innocent kids are dying, and another team's like, economic decline is going to cause a lot of joblessness and cause just as many people to starve and die and risk even greater impacts, like, and neither team explains why one is more important than the other, then it's going to be a gut check to the individual judges, and you never want that to happen because you want to be able to explain to the judge why your side is correct. So make sure you tell, if you're debating, tell the judges why it is something is true using those systems. And then I said 4 rules, but it's actually, 5 rules to judging, is that you vote comparing the last speeches. So that's the 2AR and the 2NR. So because a dropped argument is truth, if a team stops talking about it, it also is dropped, and so it leaves the debate round. So in a debate, you can't just bring something up in one of your earlier speeches and then never talk about it again, even if the other team doesn't answer it. You have to, in your next speech, go, the other team didn't answer this argument, and carry that argument through for the entirety of the debate. And so the process of judging is comparing those last 2 speeches, those final closing speeches, the 2NR and the 2AR, using all of the information that was provided beforehand in order to be able to do that. So that means is like in the first speeches, people are just like, here's my evidence that I'm going to use for the debate round. In the middle speeches, they're like, here's why my evidence is better, here's why you prefer my impact calculus, here's why you're wrong, maybe a couple of extra pieces of evidence. And then in those closing speeches, it's like, I'm still right, you're going to vote because this is what matters, and tracing it back for the the evidence that came prior. And so you have to carry those speeches through, those arguments through the entirety of the debate round. And so other ways, I know people aren't paying attention, is that they vote on arguments that are in the round, but were in the first couple of speeches, but not the reason why why they were telling them at the end of the debate round why they should win the round. So in your last speech, 2AR, 2NR, you should always start out with, I win because, vote for me because, and explain the argument that you're winning. And ideally, the majority of ballots on why I voted for the team will be that sentence almost verbatim, because that's the sentence for why you're trying to tell them to vote for you. If you brought up some good points in cross-examination at earlier points of the debate, but you're not bringing that back, the judge doesn't have that to be able to decide the round on, right? So just like a race or a sports competition is one in those last moments, but it's based upon everything you've been doing building up to that moment, it's the same thing in a debate round. It's like you're laying the groundwork in order to be able to, seal the deal in those final couple of speeches. All right? So these are the 5 rules of judging. Any questions on that? Okay. So the next set of quiz questions work like the last quiz did, which is where I said, like, give me 4 ways to answer a disadvantage or something to that effect. These will all be like, give me different ways that you could, or like last week it was like, what are the 4 parts of a disadvantage? This week it'll be like, give me 5 ways to answer a disadvantage, or give me 6 ways to answer a critique, and then you list them. Whatever number I list, each one beyond that you get correct is also going to be worth extra credit. So it's like if you remember more, you put more, but it's at a minimum number. So, how to answer a disadvantage. The trick to this quiz is that you could pretty much use the word no in front of most of the words. So you could say no link, which means that if they said your affirmative is going to cost a lot of money, you could say no link. It actually saves a lot of money in the long run, right? Is that the Congress would do a better job at dealing with trade treaties than the president would, and so there's no link. So it's just a no link type of argument. The other thing you could say is that it's not unique. So if they say you're going to hurt the economy, or you're going to hurt the Democrats' political capital, which means they won't be able to happen, or if you say not unique, we're going to have a government shutdown anyhow, then the affirmative can't cause a shutdown, can't cause a crash in the economy, because the disadvantage is not unique. So it's not a reason to vote against you because it's already inevitable, right? So it's like if they prove some reason for why your affirmative might cause climate change, you read evidence that says not unique, we've already passed the tipping point, we're not going to be able to reverse it, so we can't cause it because those impacts are already inevitable. Or you could say no link, we have nothing to do with climate change, so our plan is not going to impact that one way or the other. And so in a disadvantage, you have to win all those subpoints. You have to win the A, B, and C. When you're answering it, you're saying the A is not true, the B is not true, or no impact, the C is not true. Climate change won't kill us. The economy is resilient, so even if we decrease it now, it will rebound, right? So it's just there's no impact to the disadvantage, so it's not a reason to vote against us. So you do those 3 things. The other thing that you're able to do is that you're able to also say, well, there's also no internal link. So, like, economic decline won't end up causing wars, you're taking out the internal link portion of the debate. And so, if they said you were going to increase climate change because you increase fossil fuel emissions, you could read, not that fossil fuel emissions doesn't increase climate change, or not that you don't increase fossil fuel emissions, you could say fossil fuel emissions don't increase climate change, which is the internal link into that change, opposed to the link, which would be you increase fossil fuels. The other thing you could say is case outweighs. Even if this disadvantage is inevitable, our affirmative impacts are more important. So you just explained why your affirmative is more important and your affirmative case outweighs. You can do what's known as a link term and an impact term. The quiz question is, what is a link term and what is an impact term? A link term is where you say you do the opposite of the link. So if it says you cost money, you say you saved money versus we don't spend money. If they say you cause climate change, you say we solve climate change, right? You just do you say your result in the opposite. So the disadvantage is actually an advantage because we stop this thing from happening. We do the opposite of what your link says. An impact term is where you say that impact is a good thing, right? So if they say that you're going to that you over-constrain executive power, which one of the examples is that if we put any constraints on the president, it will constrain the president's war powers. And the war powers are essential for being able to have an effective military because you need to have a strong executive who's able to issue orders independently. No first use constrains that executive, which will, in courts, set a precedent that will constrain other war powers. And so you can impact turn that by saying presidential war powers are bad and we shouldn't have a strong executive because it allows for a more aggressive military. Versus saying no first use is appropriate delegation of powers which shore up the war powers more effectively, which is a link term. Alright, so link term, you do the opposite of link. Impact term, you say the opposite of the impact. If they say you crash the economy, you say good, capitalism is bad, crashing the economy is a good thing. That's an impact term to that argument versus a link term where you say you save the economy and you help capitalism to flourish. You can't do both of them at the same time quiz question is, what is a double turn? The answer is when you do a link turn and an impact turn at the same time. And the reason why you can't do that, if you say we save money and save the economy, and then say we should let the economy die because capitalism's bad, the other team could just be like, we agree with both these points, they say capitalism, which they say is bad, so they lose the debate round because they just flip the argument in the entire opposite direction. So in your 2AC, you have to figure out one or the other that you want to be able to do based upon the individual round and argument. And so these are also potential answers that you can use to answer a disadvantage. Beyond just saying no, you could use these. And then there's additional quiz question, what is a link turn, what is an impact turn? We do the opposite of the link. The impact's actually a good thing. What is a double turn? Running a link turn and an impact turn at the same time. All right? Any questions on how to answer disadvantages? Okay. So next is the counter plan. With the counter plan, again, there's a couple of ways that you're able to answer it. The first thing that you could say is that you could say no net benefits. Remember, with the counter plan, the job of the negative team is to prove that the counter plan is better than the affirmative, not just as good. And so if the affirmative could win that there's no reason for why it's better, there's no net benefit to doing the counter plan, the affirmative wins that debate. Okay, so that's one example of how you could do it. You could also, with the counter plan, say it doesn't solve your case. And this is an example of case outweighs. It just comes out differently with the counter plan. So with a counter plan, you can't say something like, well, our affirmative is more important because no first use is good. Because the counter plan is also declaring no first use, but it's just having the executive branch do it opposed to the congressional branch. So you can't just win that no first use is a good idea because that's not what the debate's about. But you can say it doesn't solve the case and say that executive first use or no first use policy is different than congressional first use policy. And in the evidence packet, there's a bunch of different international scholars that explain why one is better than the other, and it basically comes down to who the international community is going to believe more and what's actually going to take action in terms of Congress versus a single presidential individual. But if you can prove it doesn't solve the case, then your affirmative is a reason to vote for you. You can also say that it's not mutually exclusive. And so the word that I like for it is a perm or permutation. The quiz question is, what is a perm and what two types of off-case arguments you can use them to answer. Counterplan is one, the other is critique, but we'll get to that in a second. And what a permutation does is it explains why it's not mutually exclusive. So if like the word comes from math, is like different permutations of numbers or different combinations of things. So if we could do both ideas at the same time, we give Congress and the executive explain have a no first use policy. That's even more credibility to the international community because we have our branches of government working together and saying this is the nuclear posture we want to have, or this is our stance on treaties, is that both of our branches are designed together. And so perm, we can do them together. And so, yep.
So the quiz question would be like, how do you address a counter plan, and then like, what is a permutation?
Yeah, the question is, what is a permutation, and the two types of off-case arguments you can use it to answer. A permutation is, we could do these two ideas together at the same time, or a combination of ideas. And then the two different types of off-case arguments is counterplan and then critique. And so a lot of times in debate rounds, people will run counterplans and be like, oh, well, we could do this other thing instead. And there's no reason why we can't do them at the same time. So it's like, if you could take this class and another class that takes place after, do them both if you like it. Yeah?
So permutation is basically the opposite of double turn?
Maybe. Maybe. I think it's difficult for me to relate them as opposites. Because you're saying that instead of saying the counterplan is bad, you're saying we could do it too. Right? And whereas if you double turn, you say we caused something that we think we shouldn't be causing. And so perm is where you try and say we can do them together. And I guess I can see it as similar to a double turn, because if you're saying the counterplan is a bad idea, and then you say we could do it too, you're sort of going against each other. But with a permutation, you don't have to prove as the affirmative team that we should do them together. You have to prove that your affirmative should be done, and if it should be done by itself or it could be done with this other idea are both reasons for why it should be done. And so you could still say the counter plan is a bad idea, even if you think it's a good idea, it's not a reason to reject us because of this, right? There's another class that takes place after it, and you could be like, that's a bad class, we shouldn't take that class, we really shouldn't take this class. But if you want to, you can keep this class and take that other class at the same time, so you can still do what you want. And so if the judge thinks the counter plan is a good idea, it doesn't have to be either one. Alright, so that's, show that it's not mutually exclusive in use from. Alright. Then you can run procedural arguments against a counter plan. So if you remember, counter plans could be conditional or unconditional. Conditional being you could stop advocating it. Unconditional meaning that you're stuck with it for the entire debate round. You could say that that's unfair. If somebody ran a counter plan that said anarchy, or if somebody ran a counter plan that said world peace, you as the affirmative team would be like, that counter plan makes this debate unfair because there is no potential world of anarchy. The negative team would be like, well, that's fiat, there's no potential world of Congress constraining the president right now, and so you get to fiat that, so we can both have fiat power, but whether that's a good use of fiat or just unfair is up for debate. If the counter plan is we should have world peace, then it's like, well, there's no way I could debate that because you've just fiated in a utopia that is, makes it give me no ground. But you have to explain why that's unfair or bad for education and where debates would go because negatives would win every debate. So you can run a procedural argument. There's other reasons why a counter plan could be unfair. For instance, if you say Russia should declare a no first use policy, maybe it's a good debate to say should the United States or should Russia do it first. That could be a good debate, but it would also be a bad debate for education because we're in the United States and we should be debating United States policy and not Russian policy. You also came prepared to debate about the United States and not Russia, so that counter plan might be unfair. So you can run a procedural argument against that. But it's up to you to do that and explain why it's winning the round. You can run disadds to the counter plan. And so we're basically going to go through the off-case arguments that you can run against the counter plan. If the counter plan causes something bad to happen, it's a reason for why you should reject the counter plan. Be careful not to run disadds that link to you. So if they say the executive should self-constrain trade powers, and you say there shouldn't be constraints on trade powers, then you run a disad against yourself there as well as much as a counter plan. So you would want to generally run the disadvantage based upon the executive action. So you explain why that branch of government is bad because of some disadvantage. And you can also run critiques against counter plans. Again, same deal. If you're criticizing them for doing something that they do, make sure you don't do that same thing because otherwise you're critiquing yourself, and then that's also another way that you could essentially double turn yourself because you're saying you shouldn't do this thing and then you go ahead and do it as well. And the negative job is to negate. So if you as the affirmative critique something that you do, then you end up right back to it. Alright. So those are ways to answer counterplan. Any questions about answering counterplan? Okay. Answering critiques. You could say no link. We don't do the racist, sexist, homophobic, we're not nihilists, whatever it happens to be that they are criticizing you for, so no link. You can also say no solvency or alternative. So if you remember, because critiques generally don't have uniqueness, critiques are like philosophical counterplans where you advocate reject this team because they use gendered language, or reject this team because in the way their plan upholds specious norms because they privilege humans over other animals. And so you can have a reject them type alternative that shows that causes them to rethink. Or if you're running something like Nietzsche and you're like, we should have nihilism, your alternative would be like, we should embrace the nothingness that we currently exist, or we should, whatever it is that you want to say. On the affirmative side, you could say no solvency or there's no alternative. No matter what we do, we're going to have a government, so a critique of the government and statism doesn't matter because there's no alternative to that existing. Or just because you vote against me in this debate round, sexism will still exist, so just because I said, he said, and you're not a he, rejecting me doesn't solve anything, because the negative team to win a critique has to prove that doing the action has some solvency. This is also where you could run a permutation again on the critique, because you could reject the idea of sexism or of homophobia or of speciesism and simultaneously pass this policy idea. There's no reason why we can't pass a policy and reject patriarchal institutions at the same time. And so that would be a permutation. If you're running a critique, you would explain why their links make that permutation impossible, because it makes it contradictory and allows the system to be able to survive. But it's a question of how much you can use the master's tools to deconstruct the master's house, or how much working within the system could change the system versus the system changing you. That's generally the question of the permutation in relationship to things like critiques. You can also say no impact. Racism, sexism, homophobia, speciesism, doesn't matter. It's no impact to that. Be careful making those arguments, because those can often come up as offensive. So generally the better way to make your argument is saying case outweighs, where it's not that sexism is unimportant, but that the economic concerns are more important than some discrimination currently right now, right? In the same way in that Syria and the Saudi Arabia debate is like, yeah, we shouldn't bomb innocent children, but to lose like $4 billion in trade every year is going to cause a lot of children to starve, because all of the job loss is going to happen. So as sorry as I am, this is a better solution overall, right? That's a case outweighs argument, which sounds a lot better than saying, I don't care if those cool kids get bombed, like, there's only 11 people, right? That's going to make you sound bad. But if you say, it's horrible that this happened, but we have a larger magnitude because our case outweighs, that's going to put that in perspective more for judges and may help you be able to, win the debate rounds. Like, so when somebody is criticizing you because of a larger system, instead of just being like, no, I'm not racist, no, I'm not sexist, etc., be like, okay, I understand that maybe I perpetuated some of those things. Let's work on those solutions, and at the same time, we can't ignore this greater case, which has a bigger impact, because that's more important. And so that makes a very sort of easy strategy to be able to win, in the debate round, if you can win those points, versus just settling on this other impact is irrelevant just because I happen to, not agree with the philosophy. However, I've seen many debates won on that, because sometimes people are not very good at explaining why sexism, racism, homophobia, speciesism is bad, because to them it just seems so obvious that just saying no is, becomes difficult. And so it's like, I win a lot of debates, and our team wins a lot of debate, and just being like, human life bad, we should kill humans, because the other team, if they haven't thought about it and prepared it, isn't ready to explain why human life is intrinsically valuable. They're just like, judge, you want to stay alive, don't you? And it's like, oh, well, here's all these moral philosophers, here's all these consequences, and we're just ready for that debate. Once a team is prepared for that, we're less likely to go that route, because it's a debate to win. But if you could catch somebody off guard, going for no impact, it could be strategically useful. You could also, again, use here a link turn or an impact turn as well. You could say, actually, no first use is an important step for criticizing or for constraining the military, which is in line with feminist principles. So even if, some of my language might have been gendered, the overall policy is in line with feminism overall. So the link turn, we help move in the right direction, right? And so you could do that. You could also run an impact turn. That's where you say, that like patriarchy is a good or desirable thing. In relationship to military debates, a lot of feminists will criticize no for use or any military policy for engaging in an ongoing form of like hegemonic masculinity and international powers by trying to power project and like criticize the idea of like hard and soft power military might versus influence, which they point out has like valid references and stuff like that. And so people say impact turn. Your scholars say patriarchy is key to the military, which means even if sexism might be bad, supporting patriarchy is key to military strength. Military strength is important. And so that's an impact turn to sort of like a gendered sexism critique if the feminist scholars are indicting military institutions. Generally, most critical scholars will be indicting things like the state and like the government, and won't just be like, oh, you said a little racist word or you said a sexist word or something like that. It'll explain how those systems are incorporated into the larger institutions that continue to replicate what they say causes violence. And so you can impact turn that, explaining why it's a good thing. And again, just make sure it doesn't come out as sexism is good, racism is good, etc. If you explain why the institutions that their criticism says we should overthrow are good institutions, that then reformats the debate to being like, we can move in a positive direction, and your attempt to just throw out the baby with the bathwater is, a destructive tendency of philosophy that doesn't have to deal with the pragmatics of policy, which is why we should do the policy and also think about your stuff in the classroom, but right now this is more important. And on a critique, remember, they operate on the pre-fiat realm where it's like, we aren't policymakers right now. This is a classroom, so maybe it's more important to figure out what isms and what institutions need to be overthrown and challenged, so that way, when we do leave the classroom, we get better engaged with those systems with that knowledge. And so it's a debate then about what the debate should be when here. Should we be learning policy because Joe said resolve this as a resolution, or should we be engaging with other, other institutions? And so this class used to be a process with a lot of different departments, and so it used to bring together a lot of different people and perspectives. It still does, but like if you're in a philosophy class or a political science class or an economics class or women's studies class or African studies class, you could use the philosophy from those classes to engage with the political scholars. And if you're in the poli-sci or or the economics, use your scholars to be able to engage with the philosophers and sort of bring that knowledge into these rounds. All right. Any questions on answering critiques? Okay. How to answer procedural arguments. You could have a counter interpretation. Remember, the interpretation is where somebody says, this is what the rule should be. The counter interpretation is where you say, this is what the rule should be instead. So my mini golf example from last time, I let my kids, double tap the ball. So a interpretation would be like, you can't just hit the ball twice, you have to do a single stroke. That would be their interpretation. My counter interpretation would be like, you could do sort of those two little taps, up until the age of 10. And so that's my rule. And so once they get to 10, they have to change that. So in the debate round, if they say, that it should be statutory and or judicial is what they're advocating, they haven't picked one or the other. And so my interpretation is you have to tell me if you're using Congress or you're using the judicial branch in your first speech. And then their counter interpretation is the resolution says and or, so we could defend and or, we don't have to take a stance. You could say no violation, where you just don't violate the rule. So they said you can't, you say and or, and you're like, our first speech just said use congressional constraints, so we meet, we aren't, there's no violation here. All right? And so it's like, my 10-year-old actually, she rarely does that anymore because she just got better, eye-hand coordination, so she doesn't violate that rule anymore at that 10-year-old line as well. So it's just a no violation. Another way you could say it is we meet, which is just we meet the violation, so we're meeting the rule that you set. Then you can have counter standards or reasons to prefer. And so that's where if they say the depth of education is more important, you say the breadth of education is more important. So their interpretation is you talk too fast, you can only use conversational speed. My counter interpretation is that you should use 1.5 times speed. They say, the violation is that I went really fast, and I say, that's fine, but I met my rule, I'm only doing 1.5 times, and that's good because it means we get through more information, so it creates a better depth of knowledge and then also a wider breadth of knowledge, whereas you're just like, well, you get to talk to more people. I'm like talking to more people and being more accessible, which was their standard, is not as important as the amount of knowledge I could get into that individual debate. So just, these are better ways that we should evaluate a procedural argument. You can also say no voting issue. Even if I violate the rule, that rule just doesn't matter. It's not a reason to reject me. So if they say you talk too fast, I can say, well, that's not a voting issue. I'll just slow down in my other speeches, and if I go too fast, just let me know, right? And so you don't have to end the debate round because of it, right? So if you're on the negative side and you're in a procedural argument, you have to prove that that procedural argument is so bad that the team should lose the round because of it. If you can prove that it's not so bad, maybe it made it a little bit unfair, hurt a little bit of education, but there's something we could do to make up for it, maybe we do that instead, right? So you should say there's no voting issue. You can also say case outweighs. We violated your rule, but your rule is a bad rule, and we are talking about something more important. So people in the national debate circuit who say we should give the land back to Native Americans, they go into the debate round knowing they're violating the resolution, knowing that they're, you know, in no way, shape, or form are they going to come up with a counter interpretation that, you know, creates a semblance of what the debate's supposed to be that year. And so they just say, case outweighs the judicial norms and institutions that, you know, give procedural argumentation and the way in which the classrooms that we're debating in are on stolen land, that talking about this genocide, about what took place here, is important before we produce any knowledge. So no matter how good your policy might be, and no matter how much that knowledge production that you might have, all of that happens from having stolen the land from Native Americans, continue to persecuting a form of genocide, and instead of having that be the focus, as people right here in this moment, we should, you know, take that as, you know, the a priori educational issue. And so some of these teams would actually research the individual indigenous groups that were killed out by some of the colleges. And so it's like when we go to like Oklahoma or Kentucky and some of the universities that have land grants, like the government actually used money to help push Native Americans out of that land to build universities that were then going into halls to compete on. And maybe it's more important learning about that than just being like, oh, let's pretend we're policymakers for a second. But they don't always win that debate. They lose a lot of those debates too. Generally, the teams that do it are like really prepared for the debate, and so they're really ready for that argument, whereas other teams are like, you know, less prepared to defend the rules. But it's always just a question of what's more important, right? I've told you what we should be debating about, but no matter what goes down in these debates, I'm going to let the debates happen, because I'm going to check my beliefs and I'm going to vote on what the debaters are saying and not what I believe on and things along those lines. So it's like, you come up here and argue that this resolution is bad, and you have to convince me and you have to convince your peers of this, but it's up to all of us to vote based upon those arguments, right? Think about what this class would look like if everybody just argued about whatever they want. When you're negative, that would make it really unfair and really difficult for you to be able to debate. Maybe that's something you're interested in because the creativity and the variance is a good form of education that you think is valuable. So you could think about those reasons versus, well, we could have a more limited focus. Like, this resolution was picked by the debate community because it's issues that are going on right now that are continuously relevant. And so there are educational reasons for why this resolution is important. And if you are just going to play by the rules, if somebody else here is like, let's do this other thing, just be ready to defend that the rules and what we're debating about matters. Because debate can literally be whatever you want it to be, because as I said at the start, last lecture was that, you know, everything in debate is debatable. These are all more of, I label them rules lectures, and I think that sort of tricks you all into thinking that they are just rules, but they're all just norms of the activity. You know, when I was debating, critiques didn't exist, and then people who were just a lot of philosophy majors coming in just got good at answering the people who were political scientists and convincing the judges that this stuff matters, and now it's a staple in the debate round. Counter plans used to not exist 10 years before I debated, because the debate was like, no, should we do this idea and not this other idea? What's this notion of like opportunity cost? And then people explained why talking about opportunity cost matters, and how Congress normally doesn't just consider yes this one bill or no this one bill. Normally there's other bills that are on the table, and Congress has to decide between those, which are counter plans. And so learning to debate about that's important. And so all of these things could be essentially debatable. And if you have a style of argumentation or a type of thing that you thought about that wasn't covered here, like, you should feel free to do that, and realize at the end of the day you just have to initially convince me and the peers who are judging you why you should be able to win that round. Generally, people who are creative start off not so good, but get increasingly better because they learn how to adapt their arguments to their audience, and other people are just like, that was silly, and just don't really focus on it because they're like, oh, everybody else is doing this thing. And so there's a little bit of a learning curve to it, but if you're interested in doing it, you could do that. Again, the amount of research that you're going to get online is sort of pre-prepared from the summer, so it's like the more research you do as the debates move forward, the better you'll be at sort of like the qualifications and the more evidence that you'll have. If you read something that I'm putting up on my courses, everyone has access to that, so it's like, how good is that? You know, it's easier for you to win if the other team doesn't have the answers that are already pre-prepared. The last question is not really, after I put you into partners, the last question on the quiz would be, what is your partner's name and contact information? So that's the real last question on the quiz. The second to last question is, what is the speaker point range? At the end of the debate round, you vote for the team that wins, and then you assign speaker points. It is possible that the better speakers lose the debate round because they just didn't make the right arguments at the right time, but they showed up more prepared, and they, spoke just better because they were just better at talking. They didn't have so many ums. They, used more evidence, but they dropped these, important issues, and so I voted the other way, right? And so that happens. Generally, the better speakers do also win, but very often, because it's 2 versus 2, it's not one side has the 2 best speakers, but it's sort of like, it ends up being split. And so the question is, what is the speaker point range? It goes from 0 to 30. That's not actually what I'm looking for. It's just a trick. It really goes from goes 29.5, 29, 28.5, 28, 27.5. So generally, how debates get graded is the amount of ballots you get, including my ballot, makes up the first 70 points of it, and then the speaker points make up the final 30 points of the individual debate round. And so while you can go to 0 to 30, and while I take your ballot speaker points into consideration, it's averaged in, together and stuff like that, you really shouldn't go below a 27.5. If you go below a 27.5, it means that they have done something atrocious, which could be just horribly, unexplainably offensive, maybe wouldn't let their partner speak at all during cross-examination and their partner was really trying and they were just bullying the other team, something really bad like that, or use a second of their speech time or clearly didn't care at all. It should be really bad, and on the part of the ballot that says ways debaters could have done better, you should justify why they got lower than a 27.5. Because otherwise, even if you give somebody a 27.5, you're not really hurting their grade that much. And so the 28.5 is sort of your perfect average speaker, all right? And you could view this as a Netflix 5-star scale. 29.5 is I loved it. This was a great speech. I enjoyed being in the class today because it was interesting. I learned a lot from what you had to say. You're a good speaker. And when we get to the class tournament, I expect you to be, in finals because you were really great. Anything above a 29.5 is you've got to be ecstatic and wish that you had a recording that you would listen to again later on. So it's a 30 is perfect. 29 is 4 stars, right, on Netflix. It was a good movie, really liked it, but I'm probably not going to rewatch it again unless I'm with a bunch of people who are can we watch this movie, and be yeah, sure, I guess I really liked it. Versus loved it, I'm going to be I want to see it again multiple times. This is just 4 stars, good. 28.5 is your average. Wasn't a waste of time. It's about what I expect in a college classroom where people are just learning to debate. They did okay. 28, they struggled. There's areas for improvement. And then 27.5 is sort of, you think they're towards the bottom of the class in terms of speaking ability and stuff like that. And don't feel bad. Statistically, someone's got to be there if you're going to get there. But people who are there, you get better during the course of it. And you'll notice that in my speaker points and your peer speaker points. Because, if you have trouble and your first speech is you barely are able to get a speech out, by the end of the semester when you've done it 6 times, I promise you'll be able to give a full speech and you'll see those go up. I also know that the university's forced me to go through assessments, and so I use all these numbers to give it to them, and everyone has tracked upwards. So even the worst students, go up in this system, and it's because it'll get you better. All right, and so that's the speaker point range. I did lie again. There is another question, is how many speaker points do you take off for every 30 seconds somebody is shut? And it's half a speaker point. So if somebody was a really good speaker, but one of their speeches they were 45 seconds short, it's they deserve a 29.5, but I deduct half a point because they used 30 seconds less. And so it's for each 30-second time chunk, it's minus half a speaker point. So maybe somebody was bad and was really bad and deserves to be at the bottom of the class, but then was a minute below. That's then actually a 26.5, and reasons to improve, I'd be I had to remove a speaker point because you didn't use a full minute of your speech time. Yep.
Is that if you're 30 seconds below and 30 seconds too long, or just
30 seconds below. When it's too long, the judge's job is to stop you and say that's time, and you could finish that sentence but not ramble on and just be cut off. And this doesn't mean that if you have a 5-second pause and then a 10-second pause or stuff like that, or there's some quick thoughts here and there. It's not added up over the course of the speech. It's really for it's supposed to be a 3-minute speech, and at 2 minutes and 15 seconds you say I'm done, or you stand up there for 45 seconds silently. All right, so it's we're not trying to nickel and dime people here, but during the speeches, I'll generally call out 1 minute 30 seconds to give you a verbal prompt. It's also letting all the judges know, okay, now they've gone past the 30-second mark, so there doesn't have to be a deduction or anything like that. All right. Any questions? Yeah.
So for quiz question about don't use the 0 to 30, so just say the 27.5 to the 29.5 range.
Yep. Yeah, because I'm actually asking what should you give. but this is like the full range, and it is okay to give out a 30. Maybe somebody comes in really prepared and does a great job, and so they get the 30. They get a 30, and that's entirely fine. But where it says like what debaters did well, you should make sure you have some compliments for why they stand out. And you know, every semester there are people who get below 27.5. A lot of times it's because it's time deduction, but there's been a couple semesters where somebody's a little bit out of line, and some people feel that that was inappropriate, and so they give them speaker points below it, and they explain why. So it's like you can go below this. And so you should know this, but this is what the quiz question is looking for. All right. So going through all the quiz questions again, what are the 3 generic ways you could compare arguments or compare evidence? So what are the 3 ways you compare evidence? What are the 3 ways that you could compare impacts? What are the 5 rules of judging? What is the speaker point range? What is the deduction for 30 seconds? Then randomly asked, like, you know, give me 4 ways to answer a disadvantage, and you have to list 4 of these options. If you get more, you get more. And so those will be asked. What is it, link turn and impact turn, and how do they differ? What is a double turn? What is a permutation, and what 2 off-case arguments can you use them to answer? Questions? Any questions? Yeah?
When you ask, like, how to answer disadvantage and all of the other things, do you want 1 sentence definition for each one? Or just
No, because you could just be like no link, no impact. The things I want definitions for are like link turn, impact turn, double turn, permutation. Yep.
What were the 2 off-case arguments?
It was a counter plan and a critique. All right. Any other questions? All right. So the real last questions I told you in the quiz will be: who is your partner and what is their contact information? All right. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to put you in partners. If you already have someone here who you want to debate with, then that's fine. Just sort of like stay off, you know, on your own. Then after that, the way you should organize yourself to meet someone is that the further right you are on the political spectrum, go this way. The further left you are on the political spectrum, go that way. And then the more, if you live on campus, move towards the front, and the more you live, if you live off campus, move towards the back, because it's easier to work with people who live closer to you than further away from you. It's nice to work with someone who's got a similar political orientation than you. And just because somebody's not standing right next to you in your same spot, just start talking around to other people, and then as soon as you find somebody you're happy with, just group and sit together. I have 2 people who are absent, which means that we should have an even number here today, but there might be somebody who didn't send me an email, but I could pair up odd people who don't end up with something.